Hello, my YouTube members. Good evening. How are you all doing? I hope you all are doing well. Today is another lecture video uh, on the show of the Enlightenment and Higher Consciousness. Today's topic is the issue of race. I usually read off Wikipedia. I'm going to, being that I am so well informed, I am not claiming to be an expert in this field, but I happen to have I am not an expert, but I am definitely, have an understanding of raciology and racial classification, um, more so than the average person. Uh, although I'm not an expert, I have an understanding of raciology and racial classification. And let me see. I want to discuss a couple of topics. Um, yes, I will discuss 5 subtopics. The first one is what is race? The second is how race evolved and how many races exist. Um, the third subtopic is racial classification, how people are classified, belonging to how they're classified into a race or population group. And subtopic number 4 is racial misconceptions, false ideas about race. And number 5 would be my opinion of race. We'll start with what is race. I usually read. I notice. I don't know if many of you have noticed. I usually read off Wikipedia.com or other websites, and despite the fact that it's only 70% reliable, I'm able to distinguish which claims or which information is fact or truth and which are not. And I'm able to distinguish which falls into the 70%, which is generally fact or truth, and which one falls into the 30%, which is complete misinformation, incorrect, or was a fact or truth. And what was a fact and now has become obsolete. So we'll start with what is race. From the way, I'm just not going to even read, because I know this subject very well. And like I stated before, I'm not an expert in this field, and you can take the information for what it's worth. But I have an understanding of raciology, race science, or racial anthropology, and those are the 3 different terms. There's no standard for the name of the science or that particular field. Have an understanding of raciology and racial classification. I have a basic understanding, a limited understanding, but more so than most average people. So let's start with what is race, and I will give you my definition. Race is a population group that possesses a frequency of genes that produces racial characteristics that is unique to that population group and is distinct from another population group. So I'll repeat that again. Race is a population group that possesses a frequency of genes that produces racial characteristics that is unique to that population group and is distinct from another population group. That means it's a collection of genes or collection of racial characteristics that is distinct, that is unique to that population group. It is not one type. There are various skin tones in each race, and variation in characteristics. In Europe, for example, Europeans have a lot of what they call sub-races, which I'll explain later. Some are, if you go to the southern Europe, they tend to be slightly darker, like myself, with characteristics, darker skin tone, more pronounced features. As to in contrast, if you go to Central Europe, they tend to be lighter. Some cases have blue or brown eyes, and if you go to Northern Europe, they're a lot lighter skin and sometimes alabaster with blonde hair. Um, and that is actually part of that definition. Some of it was created by me or based on my understanding of race. But that definition was also partly influenced by a book that I read by Richard Goldsby. The title of his book was Race and Races, and it was written in the 1960s by an anesthesiologist. His name is Richard Goldsby, and he stated that race is a biological fact, racism is a sociological attitude. Um, and there was another man, I believe his name was Douglas Whitman. He is a racial anthropologist. He also stated that race is not a social construct. Society is a racial construct. So, he was also a very controversial figure. Yeah. Um, so now I'm going to go into subtopic number 2, how race evolved and how many races exist. Um, race evolved as a process of part of the biology of human biological evolution. You will also find racial types in other species like dogs. Some of it was created by human selection, but sometimes it was also a product of natural selection. You find over 100 breeds of dogs. In humans, it was a continuation of process of evolution. Natural selection is the process by which biological evolution makes possible. There are slight changes in mutation in the DNA, and these changes create mistakes, but some of them can have an advantage in an adaptation to the environment. Um, so there's still a debate as to where humans actually evolved. Some people say out of Africa theory, and some people say the multi-regional theory. Some people consider Neanderthals and archaic human beings that evolved from Africa as one species, the archaic human Homo sapiens, or some people say they were two different species. But the fact that they interbred would seem to suggest they were a lot more common, or maybe they were just one species, And so the human evolution is a very complex process of interbreeding. So I believe the multi-regional theory is most likely, and now they're coming up with Decenovians and other groups that also interbreeding, and Europeans have at least 2 to 4% Neanderthal, and in Asia it's actually as high as 20%. And so, as the human species began to, after Homo erectus left a million years ago, another group, Homo heidelbergensis, evolved in Africa. He began to migrate into Europe, evolved into the Neanderthals. I'm going to go very quickly on this. And then they evolved into Neanderthals, and they might have been, although they were separated, some people claim they were speciations. They became two different species. It wasn't enough time to become a different species. And so then the modern or archaic humans from Africa would leave Africa and to breed, but they were encountered the Neanderthals, who were, in my opinion, archaic Homo sapiens as well. They were basically one group. They interbred, biological reproduction, and created a hybrid population group that continued to evolve in Europe and in Asia, and now there's a new theory, new evidence that the same this hybrid population group, this mixed Neanderthal, archaic, sub-Saharan population group, um, remigrated back into Africa, and so now even Africans have Neanderthal DNA. And now they evolved through the process, but although we survived as a species, wherever we adapted, it began to influence what characteristics were developed. In Europe, they began to develop lighter skin tones, characteristics of thin nose, thinner lips. By the end of the Ice Age, they began to develop the population that we see in Europe, and those who are descended from Europeans, the Caucasoid race, which is a reference to the Caucasus Mountains, but that doesn't mean that you had to come from there. It's just a reference point. That is the mountains that borders Europe and Western Asia, the Middle East, or Asia Minor. And you don't necessarily have to be from Europe to be Caucasian, because other countries, like in parts of Russia, or 3/4 of Russia is in Asia, and they are Caucasian as well. So it really should be called the Eurasian race, but we call it the Europeans. We call them either European or Caucasoid race or Caucasian race. And there are places like Armenia. That's not in Europe, but they are Caucasian, just like Europeans. And then you have the sub-Saharan or Negroid race, and that is not an offensive term. Negroid, N-E, the prefix, comes from Indo-European, which means night. So it's trying to classify these people as having dark skin, because that's what they did in order to adapt to the sunlight, extreme hot weather. And in Europe, because of the lack of sunlight during the Ice Age, around 10,000 BC, I think it was between 10,000 BC to about 6,000 BC. That's 12,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. They had to develop lighter skin in order to screen out ultraviolet light and get enough vitamin D. Later on, evolution allowed Europeans to be more versatile and acquire the genetic capability to acquire vitamin D from the diet and become lactose intolerant. As a matter of fact, they discovered Labrana 1, discovered in the Iberian Peninsula, which is modern-day Spain and Portugal. And they had two skeletons. One was called Labrana 1. He was a male. He had very Mediterranean-looking skin, tan skin. And they noticed that he was lactose intolerant. So even though he was probably a hunter and gatherer, he was not lactose intolerant. But later generations would develop the ability to be able to digest milk and acquire vitamin D. And Asians also develop in their own way their genetic adaptability to slanted eyes, to protect the eye from the cold, and high cheekbones and features that would allow them to develop in East Asia. So sometimes they're called Mongoloid, which is pretty much obsolete now. It's East Asian, because they evolved in East Asia. And then later, other places where it's dry and hot, like India, or the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, and other places near that area, they call them South Asian. And then into Australia, Australoid, and so they're probably approximately Caucasoid, East Asian, Negroid, South Asian. There's approximately 5 different races, so that could be interpretable. That's the ones that I know. Oh, and then you have Native Americans, so it's technically 6. If you consider Native Americans part of the East Asian, because they evolved from East Asian, but they ended up migrating into the continent of America, or sometime around 50,000 years ago. But there are now some saying that they might have migrated much earlier than that. The East Asian group, this population left East Asia, went to the Bering Strait, and there was a glacier there that allowed them to cross the Bering Strait. And it might have been a continent, Beringia, I think it was called, and they were able to go. And it took only 80 generations, 1,000 years approximately, average age being every generation. Every 30 years, an approximate, when people reproduce is usually around 30, so that's an approximate age. Could be more or less, a margin of error of 10 years or more. And they crossed the Bering Strait, and within a 1,000 years, they were the continent North America and South America. So they are technically, although they evolved from the East Asian population, they are a completely separate race or population group. And they developed the characteristics. Some of the Native American, for example, the Inca, had the ability to live in high altitudes because and in order to do so, they had to have the genetic adaptability of developing high lungs that can allow it to breathe thinner air. And they also had other characteristics that allow them to adapt to this new continent. And later later migrated by Europeans in 1492. But the Vikings were later on. Other Europeans, they came much later, introduced the horse. There was an ancient prehistoric horse, but that eventually became extinct. Most of the prehistoric animals that were there were much larger. Eventually, having size is not only an advantage because you need more energy. And as certain food sources died out, they eventually died out as well. And eventually, all these different, although we are all one species, we develop these, where you live, your environment sets certain genetic adaptability standards, and you have to adapt to that environment and shapes where you live. You will develop these characteristics in order to adapt to that environment. And population groups today have these characteristics because they descend from this prehistoric groups that adapted to these different environments in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the continent of America. Oh, and I just wanted to state that I should have said this from the beginning, but I do not in any way in this video endorse the supremacy or prejudice of any population group, including my own, the Caucasian race, the Caucasoid race of Europe. I do not endorse any type of hatred or racism of any type, but we must acknowledge that there is race, and I will explain later in my opinion. So there is approximately 5 to 6 races, although it can be interpretable. Some people debate whether there's between 4, 5, or 6. Racial classification. Racial classification is it is not an exact science. It is an attempt to classify people based on the understanding of each population group and categorize them as belonging to a particular population group. I am a member of Facebook, and I am a member of some racial classification groups as a hobby. And I've 2 of these groups. One is called Anthropology and People Around the World, and there's another group called Races of Men, but I think that became dissolved. Racial classification is not an exact science. These charts are relative. They are not accurate. There is too much diversity in the human, in the DNA, for you to create a chart. The chart would have to consider every single genetic diversity, and even if there was similarities between individuals, there still might, slight differences. That chart would have to be so large, it would have to go around the earth. There is so much diversity, it's very hard to classify people as belonging, and using that chart, using phenotypes. There's too many phenotypes, and so the chart is just basically gives an indication. Another thing is that most people, when they racially classify, are not as when I used to do that as a hobby. I stopped doing that because it got kind of boring. But racial classification, when you judge anything, you should try to be, my rule is to be as objective and as accurate as possible. And I make my mistakes, and I'm willing to reclassify if I've been pretty accurate most of the time. Unfortunately, I've become so controversial. A lot of people don't want to classify me to the population group that I belong to, that I'm classified as, because personal reasons, and I guess they find me eccentric or bizarre or eccentric, or there's something about me they don't like, so they implement their preconceived notions or their prejudice, or sometimes some people just don't know. Most people that are in those racial classification groups are, not all of them. I met some good racial classifiers, but many of them just simply think they are educated, but they're not. There are a lot of people who are not educated. They just pretend that they are, and they make decisions with their prejudice, their ego, or their lack of, or their understanding, their prejudice, their ego, or their understanding as, or their limited understanding as their understanding makes possible. And unfortunately, or their preference too. So it's basically some people make decisions or judge people based on their prejudice, their ego, their preference, or their limited understanding as their understanding makes possible. And so it is not an exact science. As a matter of fact, even race is not an exact science, but I'll get to that later. I thought it was a very fun hobby. Again, most of the people are there are just simply people just having fun. They're not being very scientific. They attempt to be scientific, but a lot of the times we get into arguments, and I've had many arguments over the years in a couple of racial classification groups, but I've also made some friends too. Now I'm going to go into the fourth subtitle, subtitle, yeah. Racial misconceptions. The first racial misconception is there is no such thing as race. First of all, race is a biological fact. It is a product of human evolution. It's a product of biological evolution because you find in other species. If race did not exist, people would not be able to categorize people who possess certain characteristics along with other people who share very similar characteristics into a population group. You wouldn't be able to say that person is Caucasoid, the other person is East Asian or Mongoloid, or the other person is Negroid. That wouldn't be possible. If race didn't exist, people would not be able to classify people belonging to a population group. And yet this is possible. So it is not a myth, it is a biological fact. The second racial misconception is that there are some races are pure. First of all, there is no such thing as pure races at all. I know a lot of people. A lot of people talk about. A lot of people talk about the genetic. I'm going to get later into that, genetic ancestry tests. And I will say, a lot of people say because it says 100% or 95%, and I will tell you that it's very invalid. Though some people might be 100%, once you interbreed with someone who's not, your children might also develop or inherit the characteristic of someone who's not 100%. So right off the bat, and there are very few people who are 100%. And plus, they may not be 100% because they only go as far as 7 generations. So it's 500. No, it's between 500 and 1,000 years, which is 10 generations, I think, something like that. With the average age being around 30, where people reproduce, and that's an approximate age. People reproduce whenever they are able to or have the opportunity. Another misconception is that some races are superior superior to others. There are no superior races. Everyone has made a certain degree of contribution. Europeans have made contributions. East Asians have made contributions. Middle Eastern peoples have made contributions. Sub-Saharan Africans have made contributions. As far as who has done wrong to other one, there's not one race or ethnic group that has not wronged another race or ethnic group. You know, nobody. Everybody is guilty to some degree of something. Has done evil to someone at some point in human history. Another racial misconception is there are certain terminologies that people use without understanding its true meaning. One such word is the word Hispanic and Latino. It is a controversial term. I mean, even race itself is controversial, but for example, the word Hispanic means someone who speaks Spanish, who comes from a Spanish-speaking country, that is not the original meaning. That word has been distorted over a period of time and has been misdefined. Originally, the word Hispanic comes from the Latin Hispania, which originally comes from the Greek Hisperos, which means going west, meaning the Minoans. There's a theory that Minoans or the early Greek ethnic groups fled what is today Greece and went to the Iberian Peninsula, eastern, like where is Catalonia today, and called the region Hisperos when the Roman Empire. Then, when the Romans conquered the Iberian Peninsula in 200 BC until 400 AD, 600 years, they renamed it Hispania, which is direct from which evolved etymologically from Hisperos, and it means someone who comes from the region of Hispania that was under Roman occupation from 200 BC to 400 AD. And so it refers to people from the Iberian Peninsula, which is modern-day Spain and Portugal, but mostly in reference to Spain. It does not mean Spanish-speaking people, though there are some Spanish-speaking people from Spanish-speaking nations that were colonized by Spain, and some of them might have a direct descent from Spain. And they are not Hispanics. They're Hispanic Americans, but they are not Hispanics. And many of the people who live in or are born and live in Spanish-speaking countries, the 23 Spanish-speaking nations, are not direct descendants of Spain or Portugal. Many are of mixed race, like mestizo, and the definition of mestizo is someone of mixed European and Native American ancestry who possesses Caucasoid features that evolved in Europe and Native American features that evolved in the continent of America. Or mulatto, someone who possesses a man or a woman, or mulatta, mestiza is a woman. Mulatta is someone, or mulatto is a man or a woman who possesses the characteristics of European and who evolved in Europe, who descends partially from Europe, who developed Caucasoid characteristics that evolved in Europe, and possesses Negroid or Sub-Saharan, and is partially descended from Sub-Saharan Africa, and possesses the characteristics of a Negroid, or the features that evolved in Sub-Saharan Africa. Many are of mixed racial background, and they are not Hispanics. They are Spanish-speaking peoples, but they are not Hispanics. You find a lot of direct descent in areas where there was little miscegenation, which was the process. The definition of miscegenation is someone who is of. The definition of miscegenation is when a person of a population group, man or woman, interbreeds with a member of another race or population group, man or woman. And it was very common during the colonial era, even in the United States, but it wasn't very common. And so a lot of people, especially in Spanish-speaking nations, as they became independent from Spain, had a mixed race population group of different types of mixed race. And there were some European descent who did not interbreed, and you find that very commonly in the country where my parents come from, Uruguay, which is about 95% European, and a lot of Argentina. Those seem to be the country that had the least miscegenation practiced. But countries like, there were, in the rest of South America, there was a huge degree, or a certain degree of interbreeding between populations, a certain degree of miscegenation. And in the Caribbean, it was extremely unrestricted. And you find a lot of, especially wherever there was a certain population group common, that interbreeding, that miscegenation was more common. Places like the Dominican Republic, there was a lot of mixing between European and Africans, Caucasians and Negroids. And there's a huge mulatto population, only because those two population groups were common in the Dominican Republic. In Mexico, there was very few sub-Saharan or Negroid population group. They were mostly Native Americans, so the most typical population group is mestizo in Mexico, in that nation, because there was the most two common types that existed there for historical reasons, and interbreeded the most was between Caucasians and Native Americans. Let me see. Are there any other racial misconceptions I can think of? Yes, and that's about it. Oh, I'm going to go into genetic ancestry tests, or DNA tests. It's very common after, I believe it was 2010, when I think the genome was first mapped out. And it's, the tests were supposed to give you some indication of your ancestry. First of all, genetic ancestry tests are unreliable and still in the early stages. There's a margin of error depending on the company that conducts the tests, and as the technology improves, many of the results of these tests will change. First of all, it's not supposed to test the entire DNA, because most of you, only 10% of you, in terms of ancestry alone, not other biological or physiological reasons, but your ancestry alone is what makes you, or in terms of your ancestry, only 10% makes you look the way you look racially. So if you are European, and you are 100% or even 90% or even 100% European, only 10% of those characteristics make you look Caucasoid or European. They are not very reliable. They're just giving an indication. Those numbers can change at any moment, and as new alleles or genes are discovered, the numbers can change. They're not the best source. And of course, the one-drop rule, that back in the 1920s, back then, they didn't use genetic